Dr. Leona Grant had always approached life with a quiet determination, her career a testament to years of grit and unwavering focus. As a justice on the Supreme Court of Elmsworth, she carried her success with humility and grace. On this particular Thursday morning, Leona boarded a flight from Larkstone to New Haven, expecting nothing more than a routine journey. Her seat in the first-class cabin offered a brief respite from her relentless schedule. She wore a stunning designer dress, a birthday gift from her best friend, Kara. The memory of Kara's teasing voice echoed in her mind. "Leona, you've got to remind them what a modern Supreme Court justice looks like." The dress, tailored perfectly to fit her frame, added a touch of elegance to her usual professional attire. Settling into her seat, Leona retrieved her tablet and a stack of case files from her briefcase. Around her, the usual symphony of boarding echoed. Overhead bins being slammed shut, a toddler's wails punctuating the air, and the shuffle of passengers wrestling carry-on luggage into place. She was accustomed to these rhythms, having spent countless hours in the air, traveling to hearings, conferences, and events across the nation. The flight attendants caught her attention briefly as they worked their way down the packed cabin. Their crisp uniforms and calm efficiency exuded professionalism. Leona admired how they handled everything from turbulence to unruly passengers to the occasional mid-flight proposal. She smiled faintly, reminded of the countless journeys she had taken in her career, each one a step toward her current position on the highest court in the land. But there was no time for nostalgia today. Leona had a case weighing on her mind, one involving a small rural community fighting a major corporation over toxic waste disposal. It was a case close to her heart, emblematic of her commitment to justice for the marginalized. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, the safety demonstration played on the screens, but Leona paid little attention. Years of flying had made her well-versed in the procedures. Instead, her eyes wandered over her fellow passengers. Some were engrossed in their phones, others in laptops glowing with unread emails. A man across the aisle gave her a polite smile before returning to his e-reader. It was an ordinary scene, but something shifted. Leona felt it before she saw it, an uneasy tingle at the base of her neck. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a flight attendant moving down the aisle. She was checking seat belts and stowing loose bags with practiced precision, but her gaze lingered on Leona for just a beat too long. Leona's instincts, honed through years of navigating the complexities of the courtroom and public scrutiny, kicked in. She stiffened slightly, sensing something more than casual observation. The flight attendant's eyes swept deliberately from Leona's face to her dress, then to the small gold placard displaying her seat number. The weight of unspoken judgment was unmistakable. Leona forced her attention back to the case file on her lap, willing herself to ignore the discomfort bubbling beneath the surface. Yet the incident gnawed at her focus. It was a sensation she had endured many times before. The subtle glances, the dismissive tones, the moments when her competence or legitimacy was questioned, simply because of her appearance. The plane began to ascend, and Leona leaned back in her seat, steadying her breathing. She reminded herself of the mantra her late grandmother had taught her: "No one can make you feel small unless you let them." It was a truth she had carried with her through the trials of law school, the battles of courtroom litigation, and the public scrutiny of her judicial appointments. Still, the unease lingered like a shadow. The flight was only beginning, but Leona couldn't shake the feeling that something more was about to unfold. Dr. Leona Grant adjusted her position in her seat, the rhythmic hum of the engines blending with the muffled voices around her. Turbulence came in many forms, she reminded herself. Years of navigating courtroom debates had taught her how to maintain her composure in the face of adversity. This flight was proving to be no different. As the plane cruised above the clouds, the fiery hues of the sunset filled the cabin. Shades of orange and pink stretched across the horizon, painting the world outside in serene beauty. It should have been calming, but Leona found herself distracted, the flight attendant's earlier expression lingering in her mind like an unwelcome shadow. Closing her eyes, she summoned her mother's soothing voice, a memory that had been her anchor during many challenging moments. "No one can make you feel small unless you let them, darling." The hours stretched ahead, yet the cabin already felt stifling. The physical closeness of first-class passengers, hidden behind their headphones and laptops, only heightened her sense of isolation. She became acutely aware of every detail: the purposeful strides of the flight attendant passing her row, the curious glance from an elderly gentleman across the aisle, the subtle tension that seemed to ripple through the air. Leona tightened her grip on the tablet in her lap, willing herself to focus on the case file displayed on the screen. It wasn't the first time her dignity had been quietly questioned, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Yet, there was something particularly unsettling about this encounter. Perhaps it was the confined space of the airplane, offering no room to retreat. Or perhaps it was the silent but palpable assumptions surrounding her, invisible yet pressing. A sudden, deliberate touch broke her train of thought. The flight attendant brushed against Leona's arm as she moved past, though the aisle was wide enough to avoid such contact. To others it might have seemed incidental, but Leona's finely tuned instincts told her wise. These subtle acts, too small to call out yet too pointed to ignore, spoke volumes. Leona inhaled deeply, grounding herself. Moments like these were why she had chosen her path. Her career had been a relentless battle against unfairness, whether blatant or disguised in polite smiles and social norms. This was no different. As dinner service began, the clinking of glasses and utensils offered a brief distraction from the tension. Leona noticed fleeting glances from nearby passengers, some curious, others confused, as if they were piecing together the quiet drama unfolding before them. Her shoulders tensed, anticipating the next encounter. She reminded herself of her armor: professionalism, dignity, and composure. These had always been her tools in the face of prejudice. Straightening her dress, she repeated her mother's words in her mind: "They can only make you feel small if you let them." The flight attendant's cart halted abruptly at Leona's row. The name on her tag, Martha, gleamed under the cabin's dim light. Martha's movements were precise as she served the passenger across the aisle, but her demeanor shifted when she turned to Leona. Her smile, already stiff, became almost mechanical. "What will you have for dinner?" Martha asked, her voice clipped, carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments ago. "The chicken, please," Leona replied calmly. Her tone was steady, polite, a skill she had perfected long ago. Composure, she knew, was the most effective response to prejudice. As Martha placed the meal tray on Leona's table, her hands jerked abruptly, nearly spilling water from the glass. The motion wasn't enough to seem deliberate, yet it felt calculated. A pointed silence lingered between them before Martha spoke again. "That's quite a dress," she remarked, her tone carrying a subtle but unmistakable hint of suspicion. "Must have cost a fortune." The implication was clear: someone like Leona couldn't possibly wear something so fine without raising questions. "It was a gift," Leona said softly, releasing a steady breath as the words left her lips. She had long since learned that brevity often deflected ignorance better than explanation. "Oh, a gift?" Martha replied, her skepticism unmistakable. "How nice for you." Without another word, Martha turned back to her cart, fumbling with its contents. Her pause, though brief, felt deliberate, as if meant to reinforce her judgment. Leona maintained her calm, her posture unyielding, but the moment gnawed at her. Martha turned back, her expression unreadable as she glanced at Leona once more. "Enjoy your meal," she said curtly before pushing the cart forward, her presence lingering even as she moved on. Leona straightened in her seat, her resolve hardening. She would not let this encounter define her experience, nor would she let it diminish her sense of self. These small, insidious acts were why she fought for fairness every day, why she had dedicated her life to ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had faced time and time again. As the soft hum of conversation resumed in the cabin, Leona's mind drifted to the case she was reviewing. It was a battle for justice, a fight for dignity, two things she understood far too well. Dr. Leona Grant felt her patience tested as the moments dragged on. The flight attendant, Martha, had paused near her row, her behavior calculated and deliberate. Leona sensed what was coming before Martha even spoke. "I'll need to see your boarding pass," Martha said, her tone clipped and businesslike, as though issuing an order. "Just a routine check." It was anything but routine. Leona had flown with Tranquility Airlines countless times and knew the process well. Boarding passes were checked at the gate, then briefly glanced at during boarding, not mid-flight. None of the other first-class passengers seemed to be subjected to this so-called routine. Still, Leona didn't flinch. She moved with deliberate calm, reaching for her purse with practiced composure. She had faced similar situations before, moments when her legitimacy was quietly, yet unmistakably, called into question. She pulled out her boarding pass and handed it to Martha, who accepted it with an exaggerated care, as though handling something suspect. Nearby, a businessman glanced up from his laptop, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard. His brow furrowed slightly as he noticed the tension in the air. Around the cabin, passengers shifted in their seats, some feigning disinterest while others leaned subtly closer, drawn to the simmering unease between flight attendant and passenger. Martha studied the boarding pass for longer than necessary. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the details, her gaze lingering on the fine print at the bottom. Government rate. Government rate. Martha repeated, her voice rising with a faint incredulity. What exactly do you do for the government? The question hung heavy in the air, each word laced with unspoken doubt. The implication was clear. Martha couldn't reconcile Leona's presence in first class with her assumptions about who belonged there. Leona felt an all-too-familiar frustration bubble within her. It wasn't fear she felt, but a deep exhaustion. She had lived through this dance of doubt too many times. Law school boardrooms, courtrooms, even casual settings like restaurants. Always the same unspoken question. What is she doing here? I work in the judicial system, Leona replied, her tone measured. She gave no further details. Experience had taught her that explaining too much often did more harm than good. Revealing her position as a Supreme Court justice for the state of Elmsworth might shift the power dynamic, but could lead to either excessive apologies or more overt hostility. Martha's expression remained stiff as she handed back the boarding pass. Everything seems to be in order, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She turned to move the cart, but not before delivering one more pointed remark. I must say, Martha added, that dress you're wearing really isn't appropriate for air travel. It's taking up quite a bit of space in the aisle. Leona blinked, stunned by the sheer audacity of the comment. Her dress, a chic knee-length piece with elegant embroidery, was perfectly fitted and far from obtrusive. It occupied no more space than any other passenger's attire. Unlike the bulky coats and bags others had brought on board, it didn't encroach upon anyone else's space. The accusation was laughable in its absurdity, but cutting in its brazenness. A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers, some exchanging glances. An older woman across the aisle shook her head slightly, her expression briefly flashing disapproval. Leona took a deliberate breath, smoothing the napkin on her lap. The small gesture anchored her. She spoke with quiet firmness, her voice steady. I appreciate your concern, she said, but I assure you, my clothing isn't causing any obstruction. She picked up her fork, signaling an end to the conversation. But Martha lingered, her movements exaggerated as she adjusted items on her cart, clearly stalling. You know, Martha added, lowering her voice just enough to sound conspiratorial while still being audible to nearby passengers, first class has certain standards. Not everyone understands that. The words hit Leona like a sharp jab. She froze momentarily, then let her fork touch her plate with a soft clink, her appetite gone. The cabin felt smaller, the air heavier. Martha didn't move away. She hovered, her hands mechanically adjusting items on the cart that needed no adjustment. She wasn't just lingering. She was waiting, testing, daring Leona to react in a way that might confirm whatever assumptions she had made. Leona exhaled slowly, grounding herself once more. She refused to be baited into a response that would play into Martha's hands. Years of experience on the bench had taught her the power of silence and a steady gaze. Leona turned her head, meeting Martha's eyes directly. Her calm, penetrating expression carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen far worse and refused to be shaken. Is there something else you need? Leona asked, her tone quiet but firm. Her words hung in the air, a challenge disguised as a question. Martha faltered for the briefest moment before straightening and pushing her cart forward. Leona sat back in her seat, her composure intact, but her resolve burning brighter than ever. Injustice came in many forms, she reminded herself, and she had spent her life fighting them all. Dr. Leona Grant met Martha's gaze with unwavering calm, a quiet but unyielding defiance in her expression. She refused to be diminished, to let the flight attendant's petty actions define her. Martha's composure faltered under the weight of Leona's steady look. "No, nothing else," Martha said stiffly, her tone brittle. "Just doing my job." She emphasized the last word as if it could somehow justify her overreach. "Making sure everyone belongs where they're sitting." Before Leona could respond, the businessman seated beside her cleared his throat. His voice was firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I think we're all set here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Martha's lips tightened into a flat line. Without another word, she nudged her cart forward, but as she passed Leona's row, the edge of the cart struck her armrest. The motion sent water sloshing over the rim of Leona's glass, soaking her dress and darkening the intricate embroidery. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Martha said flatly, her tone devoid of genuine remorse. She made no effort to help, instead muttering, "These aisles are so narrow," before disappearing down the cabin. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then, the older woman seated across the aisle reached into her purse, pulling out a small pack of tissues. "Here, dear," she said softly, leaning over to hand them to Leona. "Some people just can't help showing their true colors, can they?" Leona offered a faint smile, accepting the tissues and dabbing at her dress with care. "Thank you," she said quietly, her gratitude genuine. The dress would dry. It could be cleaned. But the memory of Martha's words and actions, the doubt, the disrespect, would linger long after the fabric had been restored. As the cabin lights dimmed for the evening, Leona leaned back in her seat, lost in thought. Her mind wandered to the countless other young black women who faced moments like this every day, often without the buffer of titles, achievements, or prestige to shield them. The world still had so far to go. Yet as she glanced at the tissues in her hand, she allowed herself a small measure of hope. Perhaps it was these small, quiet acts of kindness, the tissues, the businessman's firm words, that could build a better community, moment by moment, passenger by passenger. Leona turned her gaze to the airplane window, where her reflection overlapped with the darkening sky. Her face appeared composed, dignified even, but her eyes carried the weight of a battle she knew all too well. She sighed deeply and returned to her tablet, attempting to refocus on the case before her. The words on the screen blurred as her thoughts returned to the environmental lawsuit she was reviewing, a marginalized community fighting against a corporation that dismissed their worth. Somehow the struggle felt even more personal now. Her gaze dropped to the dark stain on her dress, an unwelcome reminder of her encounter with Martha. In the courtroom, she was Justice Grant, powerful, commanding, unshakable. But here, thousands of feet above the ground, stripped of her authority, she was just another passenger navigating prejudice. Leona picked up her phone, scrolling aimlessly through emails, clerk communications, hearing schedules, speaking requests. Normally, these were her bread and butter, but now they felt distant, irrelevant in the confines of the pressurized cabin. Powerlessness was not a feeling she was accustomed to, and it weighed heavily on her. From across the aisle, the young woman who had glanced at her earlier caught her eye again. This time, she silently mouthed, "Are you okay?" Leona nodded, managing a small, grateful smile. The stranger's concern stirred a memory of her early law school days, when a kind word or encouraging glance from a classmate could carry her through the isolating weight of doubt. Martha passed by again, her presence unmistakable, even as she ignored Leona entirely. The tactic felt no less hostile than her earlier actions. Leona's attention tracked the sharp click of Martha's heels as she walked briskly down the aisle, the sound punctuating an unspoken sentiment, "You don't belong here." Instinctively, Leona's hand reached for her neck, searching for the reading glasses she had left in her chambers. Her mentor, Judge Irene Wallace, had once told her, "When things feel unsteady, keep something grounding close at hand. It reminds you who you are." At this moment, Leona wished for something grounding. A robe, her glasses, even the polished wood of her courtroom desk. Anything that could restore the sense of identity and strength that Martha had tried to chip away at. But she had no such object here. All she had was herself, the quiet resilience that had carried her through countless challenges. She sat straighter in her seat, refusing to let the actions of one person define her journey. The cabin hummed softly with the white noise of flight, but Leona's thoughts were far from quiet. The fight for dignity, she knew, was not confined to courtrooms or grand declarations. It was fought in these everyday moments, where the small silent battles mattered just as much as the monumental ones. "You know that's completely inappropriate." The businessman beside Dr. Leona Grant leaned slightly across the armrest, his voice low but firm. His words cut through the turbulence of her thoughts, grounding her momentarily. "You should report her," he said, his tone carrying both concern and quiet indignation. Leona considered his suggestion, letting the idea sit with her. Filing a formal complaint about Martha's behavior would certainly be within her rights. Her position as a Supreme Court Justice for the state of Elmsworth gave her the authority to ensure that Martha's actions were addressed at the highest level. But Leona knew all too well that one report wouldn't solve the larger issue. The problem wasn't just Martha. It was the deep-seated prejudices that allowed moments like these to thrive. "Thank you," Leona said softly, her voice even, measured. "Sometimes these situations are more complicated than they appear." The businessman gave a small nod, understanding but clearly dissatisfied with the injustice. Leona's mind drifted to the countless similar encounters she had endured over the years, in restaurants, retail stores, and even professional conferences. Each time, assumptions about her skin color, gender, or age had preceded her credentials, casting shadows of doubt over her achievements. She hated admitting how often she had chosen silence over confrontation. The energy required to fight back, to demand acknowledgement, often felt like a drain on her spirit. More times than she cared to remember, she had prioritized moving forward over standing her ground. A jolt of turbulence rippled through the cabin, causing passengers to glance around nervously. Leona gripped her armrest instinctively, feeling the shaky descent of the plane as if it mirrored her own inner turmoil, unsettled, unsteady, and struggling to find solid footing. She thought of her most recent court ruling, a discrimination case she had deliberated over for days. The decision had carried enormous weight, its ripple effects reaching far beyond the courtroom. Now here she was, stripped of the authority that defined her professional life, experiencing the same injustice she so often fought to dismantle. The irony was glaring. A Supreme Court justice, one of the most powerful positions in the state, rendered powerless in the face of casual discrimination. Her academic achievements, career milestones, and carefully curated professionalism, all meaningless in this moment to someone like Martha. A brief flicker of the cabin lights pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. Leona glanced around the plane, observing passengers absorbed in their routines, watching movies, sipping wine, typing on laptops. It struck her how normal everything seemed, as if the silent battle she was enduring existed in a separate reality. She reached into her briefcase, pulling out a case file. Normally, the weight of these documents grounded her, providing a sense of purpose and power. Tonight, they felt lifeless, like props on a dimming stage. The words blurred on the page as her mind wandered. She thought of past battles. Her law school professor suggesting she might be better suited to a less prestigious institution, the conferences where she was mistaken for a stenographer, the whispers and doubts that followed her through every promotion. Even at the pinnacle of her career, the shadows of those assumptions never fully disappeared. A different flight attendant approached, breaking her reverie. This one, whose name tag read Hannah, held a glass of water. Her smile was warm and professional, a stark contrast to Martha's hostility. "Here you go, ma'am," Hannah said kindly, setting the glass on Leona's tray. "Thank you," Leona replied, appreciating the brief return to normalcy. Across the aisle, the elderly woman who had offered tissues earlier leaned in again, her voice low and filled with concern. "I've been flying first class for 30 years, she said. "I've never seen such unprofessional behavior." Her expression held a mix of embarrassment and anger on Leona's behalf. Leona offered a polite smile, her tone gentle but firm. "Unfortunately," she said quietly, "it's not as uncommon as you might think." The words escaped before she could stop them, raw and unvarnished. The woman's eyes widened, and a shadow of understanding crossed her face. Her brows knit together in sympathy, and she nodded silently. Leona inhaled deeply, a heaviness pressing against her chest. Not from the cabin pressure, but from the weight of her history. In her courtroom, she wielded the authority to confront discrimination head-on, to correct systemic injustices with the force of the law. But here, stripped of that role, she was left grappling with the fragility of progress and the stubborn persistence of bias. Her thoughts turned to her niece, Rachel, a first-year law student bursting with ambition and optimism. What would she tell her about this moment? That even at the peak of professional success, prejudice remained an ever-present force? That the battles didn't stop, even when the climb was over? The cabin lights dimmed further, casting a muted glow across the faces of the passengers. Leona sat back, her gaze returning to the glass of water on her tray. She took a slow sip, allowing the coolness to steady her. This moment, like so many before it, was a reminder. The work was far from over. For her, for Rachel, and for every other young woman looking to the future with hope, the fight for justice wasn't confined to the courtroom. It was in the small, everyday acts of standing firm, of enduring with dignity, of refusing to let ignorance win. Dr. Leona Grant's thoughts were a bittersweet mix of sorrow and determination. The struggle for equity and understanding still stretched long ahead, but the weight of that reality only steeled her resolve to keep clearing the path for those who would follow. As the cabin quieted for the night, Martha reappeared, this time collecting trash. Her movements were rigid, her discomfort evident in the way she avoided Leona's gaze. There was an anxious shift in her demeanor now, a far cry from the overconfidence she had exuded earlier. Leona heard her mother's voice, a memory as steady and reassuring as the stars glimmering faintly outside the window. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay where you are, head held high. Her mother had said those words years ago when Leona faced fierce opposition to her judicial appointment. The advice felt just as relevant now. Straightening in her seat, Leona let the night sky remind her of her younger self, those countless evenings staring into the heavens and dreaming of a career that would make a real difference. She had achieved that dream, but moments like this underscored a larger truth. The work was never done. The plane hummed softly as it pressed onward through the quiet night, carrying its passengers toward their destinations. For Leona, the journey wasn't just physical, it carried her toward a renewed sense of purpose, a balance of challenge and motivation. Yet the cabin's tension refused to dissipate. It hung in the air like something tangible, stagnant, and oppressive. Each time Martha passed by, Leona felt the subtle brushes against her arm or shoulder, too deliberate to be accidental, yet too fleeting to call out. Each one chipped at her resolve, unsettling her in ways she couldn't entirely shake. The water stain on her dress had dried, leaving behind a faint trace, a quiet reminder of how quickly confidence could be disrupted. One moment, you wore it like armor. The next, you were questioning every decision, every reason for belonging in a space you had every right to occupy. Leona observed Martha as she attended to other passengers. With them, the flight attendant's demeanor was polished and professional, the epitome of airline service. But each time she returned to Leona's row, the facade cracked. Her tone grew clipped, her movements brusque, and her gaze carried a weight of silent judgment. Leona's seatmate had fallen asleep, his laptop left open to a spreadsheet. Across the aisle, the elderly woman who had been a quiet ally earlier was absorbed in her novel, though Leona noticed the furrow in her brow as she watched Martha's behavior. Another bump of Martha's hip. Another lingering glance at Leona's dress. Each small act, though easy to dismiss in isolation, accumulated like stones in a pile, growing harder to ignore. Leona shifted uncomfortably, feeling an urge she hadn't experienced in years. It was the same instinct she battled during law school, the desire to shrink, to disappear, to make herself invisible in spaces where people like her hadn't always been welcome. She had spent years mastering the art of unapologetically claiming those spaces, yet here, confined in her first-class seat, the old compulsion crept back. Her phone lit up with a soft glow, and she swiped through her photo gallery. One image caught her eye, herself draped in her judicial robes on the day of her Supreme Court appointment. That moment had been one of triumph, a milestone in her trailblazing career. Another photo showed her mid-speech at her law school graduation, addressing a sea of aspiring attorneys with unflinching determination. The stark contrast between those moments and her present reality left a tightness in her throat. How was it that someone who had reached such professional heights could feel so small in this moment? A different flight attendant approached, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. Her name tag read, Emily, and her smile was warm, genuine, a sharp contrast to Martha's clipped demeanor. She held a glass of water and asked softly, "Can I get you anything else?" "No, thank you," Leona replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Emily's presence was a brief reprieve, a moment of normalcy that Leona hadn't realized she needed. As Emily walked away, Leona caught sight of Martha standing near the galley. The flash of displeasure in her expression was unmistakable, making the contrast between the two attendants even starker. The cabin lights dimmed further as passengers settled in for sleep, but Leona remained awake, her thoughts racing as she weighed the situation in her mind. Years of experience confronting discrimination in courtrooms, public spaces, and professional settings had taught her to assess these moments with care. Yet here, in this airborne limbo, no solution felt entirely adequate. It wasn't just about Martha. This was about the systems, attitudes, and biases that allowed such behavior to exist in the first place. Leona closed her eyes briefly, drawing on the quiet strength that had carried her through countless battles. She didn't yet know how she would address this particular moment, but she knew one thing: she would not let it define her. For now, she leaned back in her seat, letting the hum of the plane steady her breathing. Outside, the stars continued to shine, indifferent to the struggles of those below. But for Leona, they served as a reminder that even in the darkest skies, light still endured. Dr. Leona Grant sat still, her calm demeanor masking the quiet storm within. The cabin's heavy tension seemed to thicken as Martha reappeared, this time carrying a garbage bag. Her approach was deliberate, her movements calculated. As she leaned toward Leona's row, the bag brushed against her face. "Oh, sorry," Martha muttered, her voice syrupy and insincere. "These aisles are just so narrow." The words weren't an apology, but a thinly veiled challenge, a jab disguised as politeness. A few rows ahead, a young woman who had been watching the earlier exchanges shifted in her seat. Her expression radiated unspoken indignation as she turned, raising her eyebrows at Leona, a silent question in her gaze. "Do you want me to say something?" Leona gave a small shake of her head, a subtle gesture of appreciation for the silent solidarity. This wasn't the young woman's battle to fight. Over the years, Leona had learned to choose her moments carefully. Sometimes, holding her ground without reacting was the most profound victory. Yet, for all her composure, each small act of ridicule chipped away at her. Like relentless waves against a weathered shoreline, she couldn't ignore the quiet pain it caused, a sharp reminder of the prejudice she had spent her life confronting. From across the aisle, the elderly woman who had been an ally earlier snapped her book shut. The sound was crisp, commanding attention. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice as authoritative as a gavel striking wood. She turned her piercing gaze to Martha. "I believe you owe this young lady an apology for your behavior." Martha flushed deeply, her face a stark shade of crimson. Still, she mustered a defense, her words stiff and brittle. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," she said. "If anyone's being inappropriate, it's not me." Her eyes flicked to Leona's dress, her meaning unspoken but clear to everyone within earshot. Leona felt her chest tighten. This was exactly what she had wanted to avoid, a public confrontation that turned her into the center of an uncomfortable scene. She had spent years in courtrooms where lawyers demanded apologies that were often hollow, given under pressure rather than born of understanding. "It's fine," Leona murmured, her voice steady, though she doubted the truth of her own words. She wanted to diffuse the tension in the cabin, but a gnawing thought lingered. Was it really fine? Was staying silent in the face of microaggressions enabling the very system she had dedicated her life to challenging? The businessman beside her stirred, blinking groggily as he sat up straighter, suddenly aware of the charged atmosphere. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Nothing that needs to concern you, sir," Martha replied quickly. Her polished professional mask snapped back into place as she tried to smooth over the situation. Her words were smooth, but the illusion had crumbled. The once quiet bubble of first class now buzzed with the faint hum of passengers' attention. Leona felt their eyes on her. In the courtroom, being the center of attention was a position of power, one she commanded with authority. Here, the gaze felt different. Piercing, exposing, like being judged for occupying a space someone else had decided wasn't hers to claim. Needing to ground herself, Leona reached into her briefcase and pulled out a photograph. It was of her grandmother, standing tall and proud, her chin held high despite the adversity she had faced. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, a steady drumbeat of wisdom. "Hold your head high. Don't let anyone take your dignity." Leona studied the photo for a moment, drawing strength from her grandmother's unyielding spirit. What advice would she offer now? The plane entered its final hour of flight, the hum of the engine softening the tension somewhat. Passengers began settling in for the night, yet Martha returned once more. Her presence reignited the unease like a match struck in a dark room. This time she bent low, her voice a sharp whisper. "Your dress is still obstructing the aisle," she hissed, her words slicing through the ambient noise. Something shifted in Leona. Perhaps it was the fatigue of enduring this quiet antagonism for so long. Perhaps it was the photograph tucked away in her case, a reminder of who she was, and who she refused to let anyone diminish. Leona straightened in her seat, turning to face Martha. Her voice, low but firm, carried the quiet authority of years spent presiding over difficult situations. "What exactly?" she asked, her tone pointed yet controlled. "Do you mean by appropriate?" Her question hung in the air, deliberate and sharp. Martha stiffened, clearly caught off guard by the direct challenge. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for allies, but she found none. The passengers around her responded only with disapproving gazes. A young woman in a nearby row sat up straighter, her phone in hand, poised to document every second. "Well," Martha stammered, her professional veneer cracking, "I just meant." Leona's steady gaze didn't waver, and Martha's words faltered. In the face of such quiet strength, the pretense of justification couldn't hold. Martha's voice faltered, her attempt to explain thinly veiled in condescension. "I just meant something more suitable for this section of the plane," she stammered. Her words landed with all the subtlety of a gavel striking the bench, echoing in the now silent cabin. Across the aisle, the elderly woman who had earlier stood in quiet solidarity set her book down with deliberate care. Her voice, sharp and unyielding, broke the tension. "I'm wearing a designer dress too," she said, her tone cool yet challenging. "Is mine also inappropriate? Or is there another reason you're singling out this passenger?" Martha froze, her face turning a deep crimson. I didn't mean," she stuttered, her posture visibly shrinking as the weight of the passengers' collective judgment pressed down on her. Dr. Leona Grant remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Years of courtroom experience had taught her the power of silence, to let someone's words hang heavy until their meaning became undeniable. From beside her, the businessman cleared his throat. His voice, calm and resolute, carried the weight of truth as he spoke. "I've been flying first class for 20 years, he said. "I've seen passengers board in everything from sweatpants to business suits, and not once have I heard anyone question their clothing choices." Around him, heads nodded subtly. The once tense atmosphere began to shift as murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. Martha's polished demeanor cracked further, uncertainty flickering across her face as she realized the tide of opinion had turned against her. Her earlier composure unraveled under the mounting disapproval. Leona, however, remained seated, her expression calm, yet layered with the gravity of someone who had endured countless battles against injustice. Slowly she spoke, her words deliberate and measured. "Perhaps," she began, "we should be honest about what this is really about." Leona rose from her seat, taking her time. Her movements were deliberate, her stature commanding. It was not an act of aggression but a quiet declaration of self-dignity. Her eyes locked with Martha's, steady and unwavering, prompting the flight attendant to instinctively take a step back. A hush descended over the cabin. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity, quiet guilt, and silent support. When Leona spoke again, her voice carried a calm authority that demanded attention. "I am Dr. Leona Grant," she declared, each word precise, cutting through the tension like a blade. A justice on the Supreme Court of Elmsworth. Gasps rippled through the cabin as Martha's face turned pale. Her eyes widened in shock, and she stumbled back a step. Leona's voice remained steady but resolute as she continued. "This dress," she said, gesturing lightly, "was a gift from a dear friend. I shouldn't have to explain that my seat on this flight was booked through official government channels, or that it shouldn't even matter." She paused, her tone rising just enough to command the moment. "What matters," she said firmly, "is that I, like every other passenger on this flight, am entitled to be treated with basic respect and dignity." Her words settled over the cabin like a blanket of gravity. Martha visibly trembled, the enormity of the situation finally dawning on her. Murmurs of agreement spread among the passengers. Some exchanged knowing glances, a few nodded firmly, as if silently chastising themselves for not intervening sooner. Others appeared embarrassed by their quiet complicity. "I didn't," Martha stammered, her earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of accountability. "I had no idea." "And that," Leona replied softly but firmly, "is precisely the point. You had no idea who I was, yet you felt comfortable treating me with blatant disrespect. Would knowing my title have changed your behavior? Should it have?" Martha opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a young woman seated farther down the aisle raised her phone. "I've been recording this," she said, her voice steady but edged with discomfort. "Not to make trouble, but someone needed to document how she's been treating you throughout this flight." Martha's composure shattered entirely as the truth of her actions was laid bare. Her professional mask slipped, replaced by an expression of quiet horror. "I didn't mean," she began weakly. "I was just trying to maintain standards." But her words faltered, unable to withstand the weight of their own thin justification. At that moment, another flight attendant stepped forward, Emily, the one who had shown kindness earlier. Her voice was firm but kind as she addressed Martha. "I'll take it from here." Emily placed a gentle yet resolute hand on Martha's arm, steering her toward the galley. She then turned back to Leona, her expression apologetic. "Ma'am," she said softly, "on behalf of the airline, I deeply regret what you've experienced." Leona nodded once, acknowledging Emily's sincerity. She knew better than to place much faith in apologies, but she appreciated the effort. As Martha disappeared into the galley, the cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The tension remained, but the tide had turned. Leona sat back down, her dignity intact, her resolve unshaken. The work was never finished, she reminded herself. But tonight she had taken a step, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved the same respect and dignity she had demanded. Dr. Leona Grant acknowledged Emily's apology with a simple nod, her expression neutral. She was no stranger to carefully crafted apologies, the kind meant to smooth over public embarrassment rather than foster meaningful change. As she sank back into her seat, a few nearby passengers offered quiet gestures of support, gentle touches on her arm, respectful nods. Across the aisle, the elderly woman who had spoken earlier blinked back tears. "That was long overdue," she whispered softly, her voice laced with emotion. As the plane began its descent, the subtle shift in cabin pressure served as a reminder that they were returning to solid ground. Yet, in this suspended space between sky and earth, Leona felt she had earned a victory, not through her position or power, but by simply standing firm in defense of her dignity. It was a small, profound victory, tinged with the bittersweet reality that her title, not her basic humanity, had elicited change. The cabin fell into a charged silence, broken only by muted whispers and the soft rustle of passengers retrieving belongings in preparation for landing. Martha had retreated to the galley, her earlier arrogance replaced by pale, tear-streaked shame. Leona absently smoothed her dress, her fingers brushing against the faint dried water stain. A quiet reminder of how easily comfort could be disrupted. Her sharp ears caught the low, trembling tone of Martha's voice as she spoke to another flight attendant, but the words were indecipherable. Emily moved through the cabin once more, her expression still apologetic as she handed out last-minute drinks and snacks, clearly striving to reset the atmosphere. The young woman who had recorded the earlier confrontation sat nearby, clutching her phone tightly, her uncertainty evident. She caught Leona's eye, silently seeking guidance. Leona gave her a subtle shake of the head, a gesture that said everything without words. Leona understood the power of documentation, especially as a safeguard against revisionist narratives, but she also knew its weight. Sometimes evidence spoke louder when left unsaid. The businessman beside her cleared his throat hesitantly. Leaning slightly toward her, he spoke in a low voice meant only for her. "I've seen a lot of bad behavior on flights," he admitted, "but that was something else." After a pause, he added, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier." Leona turned to him, her expression softening. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "knowing when to speak is as important as knowing what to say." Over the years, Leona had learned that timing often served as the silent partner of justice. She appreciated his words, even if they had come after the fact. As the seatbelt sign illuminated and the plane made its final approach, a subdued calm settled over the cabin. The usual pre-landing bustle was strangely muted, weighted by the collective experience of what had unfolded mid-flight. Just as passengers began gathering their belongings, Martha reappeared. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she approached Leona's row. Gone was the arrogance and self-assuredness that had marked her earlier behavior. In its place was raw humility. "Justice Grant," Martha began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." The cabin collectively froze, the weight of this final exchange palpable in the air. Leona's gaze didn't waver as she took her time, reflecting on the countless cases she had presided over. She thought of the moments when individuals were forced to confront the consequences of their actions. This cabin, in its own way, had become another kind of courtroom. "Sometimes," Leona said gently but firmly, "our actions speak louder than any words could." She regarded Martha with a calm intensity, not with anger, but with an insistence on accountability. "Today," she continued, "your actions spoke volumes about the assumptions that harm not just me, but countless others in our society. Recognizing that is a first step." Tears welled in Martha's eyes as she nodded, her shame clear. For once, those tears weren't of self-pity, but of painful self-recognition. The conversation was cut short by a sudden jolt of turbulence. The cabin shuddered briefly, the physical unease mirroring the emotional tension still lingering in the air. From a few rows back, a child's curious voice broke the silence. "Mom, why is the flight attendant crying?" The innocent question hung in the air, a reminder that even the youngest among us could sense when something wasn't right. Leona sat calmly, addressing those nearby in a low, steady tone. "I've spent my career fighting for justice," she began, her words reflective. "Not just in high-profile cases, but in everyday moments like these, the moments that define who we are as a society." Across the aisle, the elderly woman nodded silently, her eyes shimmering with unspoken emotion. She had likely witnessed countless moments like this in her lifetime, small, pivotal instances where prejudice left invisible cuts that lingered long after. Leona's voice remained steady. "We are all accountable for the way we treat one another," she added, her words directed to no one in particular, yet meant for everyone. As the plane touched down, the weight of the journey, both physical and emotional, settled over Leona. The battle for justice wasn't always fought in grand gestures or sweeping decisions. Sometimes it unfolded quietly, in the small, everyday acts of standing firm and demanding better. For Leona, this was one of those moments, a quiet triumph, born not of titles or power but of unwavering dignity. Martha wiped her tear-streaked face with the back of her hand, her earlier professional composure shattered and replaced by raw vulnerability. Her voice trembled with shame as she spoke. "I'll accept whatever consequences come from this," she said. "I deserve to lose my job." "Doctor," Leona Grant regarded her thoughtfully. "Perhaps," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with empathy, "but losing your job won't address the deeper issue." Her gaze remained fixed on Martha, carrying the weight of years spent observing the limits of punitive action. "What truly matters," she continued, "is what you take from this moment, how it changes the way you see and treat others." Leona had seen time and again how punishment alone rarely led to growth. Too often, it left people hardened rather than healed. Real change required reflection, a willingness to confront one's own biases and work toward becoming better. Outside the window, city lights sparkled against the night sky as the plane made its final descent. The pressurized cabin caused ears to pop, a subtle reminder of their return to the world below, a world where injustices like the one Leona had just endured were too often overlooked or left unresolved. Emily reappeared, her calm professionalism unwavering as she gently guided Martha back toward the galley. Leona watched them walk away, her sharp hearing picking up the faint sound of Martha's muffled sobs. The noise didn't bring satisfaction. It carried no sense of victory, only a familiar weariness, a sobering awareness of how much further society still had to go. Progress was never easy, nor was it quick. The young woman with the phone hesitated before tucking it away. Her expression was pensive as she turned toward Leona. "You know," she began, her voice brimming with sincerity. Leona nodded solemnly, already understanding the weight of what the young woman wanted to express. Her dress, once damp with spilled water, had dried completely. The stain was now faint, nearly invisible, but the emotional imprint of the confrontation would linger long after the physical evidence had faded. The plane landed, with a soft bump, its wheels meeting solid ground. As the cabin came alive with the usual hustle of passengers eager to disembark, something was different. There was no mad rush to the exit, no impatient shuffling to be first. Instead, a collective stillness hung in the air, as though everyone understood that this moment deserved contemplation rather than haste. Across the aisle, the elderly woman who had been an unwavering ally earlier rose slowly, gathering her belongings. She paused, leaning toward Leona. "You know," she said quietly, "I've flown for 40 years. I've seen things like this happen too many times, and I've never said a word. I always thought it wasn't my place." Her voice caught briefly, a shadow of regret flickering across her face. "Today taught me it's everyone's place." Leona met the woman's gaze, offering a small but warm smile. "Thank you," she said, her words simple but heartfelt. As passengers began filing out of the cabin, many paused to acknowledge Leona. A middle-aged woman touched her arm gently and whispered, "Thank you for the way you handled all of this. My daughter is in law school. I'm going to tell her about you." The businessman who had sat beside Leona throughout the flight handed her his card. "If you need a witness statement, don't hesitate to call me," he said firmly. His expression softened with a quiet realization. Privilege often meant failing to notice injustice until it was too glaring to ignore. At the front of the plane, Martha was nowhere in sight. Instead, Emily stood by the door, smiling warmly at each passenger as they disembarked. When Leona approached, Emily stepped closer, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "The airline manager is waiting for you at the gate," Emily said gently. She hesitated again, then added, "But I just wanted you to know, not all of us." Her voice wavered, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Leona reached out and rested a reassuring hand on Emily's arm. "I know," she said simply, her tone carrying a quiet strength. For all the years she had spent encountering prejudice, Leona had developed a discernment for allies, those who carried their support not loudly but with steady conviction. As she stepped into the jet bridge, Leona saw a man in a crisp suit waiting. Harris, the airline manager. His expression was carefully composed, a mix of respect and corporate damage control. Behind him stood Martha, her figure smaller under the harsh airport lighting. Her eyes were swollen, her hands clasped tightly together, as though holding herself together. "Miss Grant," Harris began, his voice polished and practiced. "We want to extend our deepest regrets for your experience today. This is not representative of our airline's values or standards." Leona raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I'm not here for rehearsed apologies," she said firmly. "What I want is action, not for me, but for everyone who comes after me. Your airline needs to implement comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training. Not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to grow." Harris blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Clearly he had expected demands for compensation or legal threats, not a call for meaningful reform. "This moment doesn't need to end in shame," Leona continued, her voice steady and resolute. "It needs to begin with change." Behind Harris, Martha's lips parted as if to speak, but she quickly looked down, the weight of her actions still pressing heavily upon her. Leona met her gaze briefly, offering no anger, only the quiet insistence that accountability must lead to growth. This wasn't just about justice for herself, it was about justice for everyone who had ever been silently diminished, their humanity overlooked. For Leona, that was the work that truly mattered. "I'm not here for rehearsed apologies," Dr. Leona Grant said firmly, her voice cutting through the hum of the terminal. "What I want is action, not for me, but for the people who come after me. Your airline needs comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training, not as punishment, but as an opportunity to grow." She paused, her gaze steady on Harris, the airline manager. "This moment doesn't need to end in shame. It needs to begin with change." Harris blinked, his polished professionalism momentarily faltering. Clearly, he had anticipated demands for compensation or legal threats, not a call to accountability and reform. For a moment, her words left him speechless. Behind him, Martha took a small, hesitant step forward. Her voice was barely audible over the ambient buzz of the terminal. "I know, sorry isn't enough," she said, staring down at her hands. "But I want you to know that I see what I did today. I really see it. And I'm ashamed." Slowly, she lifted her eyes to meet Leona's. Her vulnerability was stark and unguarded, her remorse plain. Leona studied her carefully. Over the years, she had seen many people face the consequences of their actions. Some were filled with genuine regret, while others merely felt sorry for being caught. Martha's shame seemed genuine, but Leona knew the true measure of remorse lay not in words, but in actions to come. "Use this," Leona said quietly but firmly. "Let it change how you see others and how you treat them. That's the only apology that matters to me." Turning back to Harris, she added, "I'll expect updates on your training programs. My office will follow up." As passengers continued to file past, many nodded at Leona in silent support, their expressions a mix of gratitude and respect. A few offered small, sincere smiles, acknowledging her quiet but impactful stand. The young woman who had recorded the incident lingered nearby, holding her phone awkwardly. Her conviction was evident, but doubt flickered in her expression as she hesitated. "Do you?" she began cautiously, unsure how to phrase the question. Leona shook her head, her voice calm but resolute. "Keep it," she said. "But instead of using it to punish, use it to teach. Sometimes, seeing ourselves through someone else's eyes is the most powerful wake-up call we can have." The young woman nodded slowly, tucking the phone away with a thoughtful expression. As the airport buzzed with its usual energy, families reuniting, travelers rushing to connections, Leona felt herself slipping back into her familiar role. The steady composure she wore so often as a judge returned like armor, but something inside her had shifted. This wasn't just about handling a difficult moment. It was about inspiring change, confronting the silent complicity that allowed prejudice to thrive. Before heading to collect her belongings, Leona felt a gentle touch on her arm. She turned to see the elderly woman from the plane. "You've taught more than just Martha today," the woman said quietly, her sincerity evident. Leona smiled, her gratitude silent but genuine. Walking through the terminal, the click of her heels against the floor echoed softly, a steady rhythm against the backdrop of bustling travelers. Her briefcase felt heavier, though its contents were unchanged. Inside were legal documents, pages of arguments and precedents she had spent her career defending. But after the events of the day, their significance felt deeper, their purpose more profound. Her phone buzzed with a message from her clerk about the next day's hearings. The reminder of her orderly, structured profession felt strangely discordant after the raw, emotional reality she had confronted at 30,000 feet. Pausing at a large window, she looked out at the airfield. The evening's darkness was dotted with the glow of runway lights, as planes ascended and descended in their endless cycle. Somewhere out there, Martha was beginning her own journey home. Leona could only hope their interaction weighed on her in a meaningful way. Change wasn't always immediate, but it started with a moment of recognition, a crack in a worldview. Maybe, just maybe, what had happened today would not simply alter Martha's behavior, but shift her understanding of others. Leona thought of Chloe, the young woman who had recorded the ordeal. Chloe had promised to send the video to Leona's office, not to punish, but to educate. "People need to see how these things happen," Chloe had said. "They build from small moments into something bigger." Those words stayed with Leona, triggering memories of her years on the bench. How many discrimination cases had she presided over? How often had lawyers debated the nuances of intent versus impact, dissecting harm as though it could be cleanly measured? She reflected on the power of small moments. The countless, often overlooked instances where prejudice left cuts too small to see, but deep enough to linger. Today had been one of those moments, but it had also been a chance to start something larger. As Leona moved toward baggage claim, her thoughts lingered on the possibility of change. Progress, she knew, was built one moment at a time, and today she had planted a seed, not just for Martha, but for everyone who had witnessed what had unfolded. For Leona, the work of justice wasn't confined to the courtroom. It lived in these quiet, everyday acts of courage and compassion. Moments like this reminded her why the fight was worth it, even when the journey felt endless. Dr. Leona Grant stared out the car window, her reflection overlapping with the blurred city lights. Her thoughts returned to the steady erosion caused by countless small injustices, the looks, the assumptions, the unspoken dismissals. Each one seemed minor in isolation, yet together, they chipped away at a person's sense of belonging. Her gaze shifted to her dress, once pristine, but now carrying a faint stain where the water had spilled. The mark was hardly noticeable unless you knew where to look, yet it felt emblematic of how prejudice lingered, barely visible, always present, and indelibly etched in memory, even as it faded from sight. As a group of flight attendants in crisp uniforms walked past the terminal, Leona wondered about their stories. Had they faced discrimination themselves? Had they witnessed it? If so, had they spoken up or stayed silent, unsure or afraid to intervene? The thought left her with an ache she couldn't quite name, a reminder of how hard it could be to challenge the status quo, even when it was wrong. Outside, the cool night air greeted her as a balm after hours in the stifling cabin. Her driver waited patiently at the curb, but Leona lingered, savoring the moment of freedom. She thought of Margaret, the elderly woman from the flight, whose words echoed softly in her mind. "You've taught all of us something about dignity and justice." Leona hadn't boarded the plane intending to teach anyone a lesson, yet the day's events had transformed the flight into an unplanned classroom. Sometimes she realized the most powerful teaching moments weren't meticulously planned but stumbled upon, born out of necessity rather than design. For years, Leona had helped shape laws to protect the rights of the vulnerable. Her written opinions would guide generations of judges, but today reminded her of a truth she couldn't glean from legal briefs. Justice wasn't confined to courtrooms or documents. Justice thrived in the quiet, everyday acts of standing up to prejudice. It lived in those moments when speaking out carried more meaning than staying silent, even when silence would have been easier. Tomorrow, Leona thought to herself. Tomorrow, she would return to her chambers, don her robes, and preside over new cases. The formal structures of justice awaited her, but she would carry today's experience with her, a reminder that the law was only part of the equation. The car door opened, and Leona slid into the familiar leather seat. As the vehicle pulled away from the airport, the city lights blurred into a kaleidoscope outside her window, each glow a reminder of the countless intersecting lives and untold stories happening simultaneously. Somewhere above, planes continued to streak through the night sky. Other battles were being fought in unassuming places, other assumptions challenged, other perspectives quietly shifting. Her thoughts drifted to Martha, Chloe, and Margaret. How remarkable it was that a few hours in the close quarters of a plane had managed to connect their lives, however briefly. Each person had left the encounter changed in some way, nudged toward understanding, however small. Reaching for her phone, Leona began drafting notes for an upcoming speaking engagement at a law school. She had a new story to share now, one more personal than any she had told before. It was a testament to the quiet but profound ways justice and injustice revealed themselves in unexpected places. Reflecting on the day, Leona realized that the practice of law was about more than crafting arguments and reaching verdicts. The best lawyers and the best people understood their responsibility wasn't merely to navigate legal systems, but to challenge prejudice wherever it appeared. Her briefcase rested at her feet, filled with case files, law books, and documents waiting to be dissected in pursuit of fairness. But today had taught her something those books never could. That sometimes the root of justice lay in the simple courage to stand your ground. Moments of prejudice, however small, could become opportunities for growth, When met with dignity and resolve, even the smallest actions had the potential to ripple outward, subtly altering the lives of others. As her home came into view, Leona felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Alongside it was a deeper sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, and new opportunities to shape the law. She walked inside with a renewed clarity. Today wasn't about a legal victory, it was a personal one. A reminder that justice was a living, breathing force. It needed to be nurtured, not only in the courtroom but in everyday life, where even small moments could lead to profound change. Today, Leona had stepped beyond the courtroom and into the unfiltered, everyday battle for dignity and respect. She hadn't been seated at the bench, cloaked in the authority of her position. Instead, she had been a passenger on a plane, a witness to prejudice, and a teacher for those who observed her response. She had been a participant, not merely an observer, in the ongoing work of building a more just world. And somehow, that felt like the most meaningful title she had ever carried. The air outside her window was still, the quiet night sky dotted with distant stars. Somewhere in that vast expanse, other planes were flying, carrying passengers unaware of the small revolutions happening in their own lives. Leona's thoughts returned to the faces from her flight. Martha, the hesitant flight attendant whose bias had been exposed and challenged. Chloe, the young woman determined to use her footage to teach, rather than punish. And Margaret, the elderly passenger who found her voice after decades of silence. Each of them represented a different thread in the tapestry of change, woven together by the events of the day. Her heart swelled with a bittersweet sense of accomplishment. The progress she sought wasn't just about landmark rulings or legal precedents. It was about these small, often invisible moments that challenged assumptions, provoked introspection, and nudged understanding forward. Leona thought about the young law students she would address in the coming weeks. Her story from today would serve as a reminder that the law was not confined to statutes and courtrooms. True justice required compassion, courage, and the willingness to see humanity in every interaction. As she placed her briefcase on her desk, its contents waiting for the next day's challenges, Leona reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The law had given her a platform, but her humanity had given her purpose. Tonight, she had wielded both, and in doing so, she hadn't just upheld the principles she stood for, she had lived them.